5 people were killed and at least 8 people wounded after a gunman began randomly shooting passengers at the Fort Lauderdale airport.
321, we have shots fired. We have one suspect down. We need ends here.
Well, he's got his hands swept there for it now. That's what kind of feeling that's about to happen.
That looks like a bad dude, too, to be honest.
10 days ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and in 5 days, I'm starting intensive chemotherapy.
Hold on, just a little while more. Hold on, just a little while more. Hold on, just a little while more. Everything will be alright. Everything will be alright. Pray on just a little while more. Pray on just a little while more. Pray on just a little while more. Everything will be alright. Everything will be alright.
Hold on, just a little while longer. Pray on, just a little while longer. Fight on, just a little while longer. Everything will be alright. Oh, everything will be alright.
Fight on just a little while longer.
No matter what, you got to fight on.
Fight on.
Don't you give up, don't you give up. I'm here to tell you everything will be alright. You gotta hold on. Everything will be alright. Everything will. It'll be alright. Joy's coming in the morning. It'll be alright. It's gonna be alright. It's gonna be alright.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be back with you. I am Pastor Robert Johnson, and if I can get that banner out of your way so you can so you can see it, it's a joy to be back with you. I'm going to bring my friends, my co-hosts on, my amazing co-hosts, Pastor Cheryl Jefferson Bell, Pastor LaDonna Williams. I'm just kidding, LaDonna Hunt. LaDonna Williams Hunt. And the amazing, our online pastor, Ashley Moore. Okay, let's learn something. There we go. we were getting some extra Isaac Cates music there. Isaac Cates, thank you so much for letting us use your music for this broadcast. You are amazing. I hope hopefully you all enjoyed Isaac's music. If you want to hear more of his music, I want to encourage you to go to YouTube and type in Isaac Cates, Cates. You can find his videos, his music, and lots of his stuff there. You can also find him over at Church of the Resurrection. You can find him over there. He's a part of our music team, but he's all over the world. He has been in Toronto, Canada of recent, doing workshops over there, but he is just a world-renowned musician. We're so delighted to have him here. We're back for our final Black History Month conversations, the last session, and we've had so much fun. We want to thank Dr. Shana Masheko for her amazing contributions, been a part of this month with us. And we close out tonight. We focused on African American history on a national level. Tonight, we're going to focus more in on Kansas history, Kansas, on a little bit of Missouri history. And we have with us, we are so blessed to have with us. Before I bring him on, Pastor Cheryl, LaDonna, Pastor Ashley, would you all take a moment and greet our audience and just thank them for participating over the last few weeks?
Well, I am grateful for everyone's presence, support of this programming for Black History Month. And I don't know about you, but I learned quite a bit. And so this time has been a blessing to me. And I hope it has been for you. And it encourages us to keep on keeping on this journey that we're on together.
On behalf of Allies for Racial Justice, I want to welcome everyone and thank you, Pastor Robert, for having this idea and seeing it through to fruition. Allies for Racial Justice is a joint is a collaboration between St. James United Methodist Church and Resurrection, a United Methodist Church, to try to bridge the gap with relationships and social actions, eliminating the racial divide.
And so we will, and thank you for sharing that, LaDonna. And for those of you who are part of Resurrection, if you've not gotten involved with Allies for Racial Justice, if you'll reach out to LaDonna or to Pastor Cheryl, they can get you connected. We've got more things on the horizon, more things coming. We did a study on MLK's book, Strength to Love, back in the fall of 2023. And at the end of that study, people were asking what's next. This was one attempt to give you a next, but this is a minuscule attempt. We want to do a lot more to impact our community, impact our city. And so if you want more information, you can contact Pastor Cheryl Jefferson Bell at Resurrection. You can contact her at cheryl.bell@core.org, cheryl.bell@core.org, and you can do that. I assume Allies for Racial Justice has a core address, email address?
No, we do not. We have a Facebook page and a website, Allies for Racial Justice.
So you can look up Allies for Racial Justice on Facebook as a website, but also find them on Facebook. As a matter of fact, this broadcast, one of the places we're streaming this is to the Allies for Racial Justice Facebook page. Pastor Ashley, would you greet our folks tonight?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ashley Morgan-Kirk. I'm glad to be here. I know that several of us who are on screen right now have been able to have some side conversations, is what I'm going to call them, after several amazing sessions, and we're having a great time. So I'm hopeful other people are, and I've only heard great things. So it's been really fun, and I look forward to tonight too. But one of the resounding things that we've talked about is how much we have not learned until this point.
Yeah. And I think we're all going to be blown away. Our speaker tonight, let me bring him on, is Mark McCormick, and we're so delighted to have Mark McCormick on with us. He is a former director. He is the former director of the Kansas African American Museum. He currently works for Kansas ACLU. He's an award-winning author. He wrote a book called Some Were Men, Well, I'll let him tell you about that. Paupers and some were kings.
Mhm.
And he has written several articles for several significant periodicals that were highly acclaimed. I consider him another public intellectual. You all know that I refer to Dr. Masheko as a public intellectual, and we have another one on with us tonight. He is a public intellectual, and we're so delighted. Mark, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
I don't know, Rev. You kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel with me today.
Hardly. So, Mark, thank you. You and I have known each other. You were just really kind to me when I arrived in Wichita 7 years ago. Almost.
I met you at the museum.
Met me at the museum. That's right.
Talked your ear off, and then you came back.
And then you came, and then you kept showing up. I'd invite you on the stuff, and you honored me by showing up. But you did an amazing work with Kansas African American Museum, and now doing amazing work with Kansas ACLU. Would you just quickly share some of the work that's happening over at the Kansas ACLU?
Well, one of our campaigns is to try and eliminate juvenile fines and fees. A lot of people don't understand this, or they don't know this, but when a child goes to prison in Kansas, they have to pay for all that incarceration time. And many of our kids who go through the system are emerging as adults, $5,000, $10,000 in debt. We don't even let kids work, and yet we're assessing all these fines and fees, and we're burying them before they can even fly. So we're working very hard to get a bill passed, but also to raise public awareness of how this system is so destructive to young people's lives who are trying to get their lives together. That's one thing that we're working on here. And then we also are focused intently on voting rights. Every year, it seems that extremists are putting up more barriers between certain groups of people in the voting box, and we fight that, with all we got. So I appreciate the opportunity to share that as well.
Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for you've spent your entire life really in public service and trying to make the lives of all Kansans and all Americans better. And I so appreciate you for that. Would you want to say just a quick word about the Kansas African American Museum and kind of tell people what's there and how they can support it, what's coming on the horizon for it,
and where it is.
And where it is. Yes.
The Kansas African American Museum in Wichita, it's a state museum devoted not just to history, but also to culture. When I was there, I considered my organization to be an activist organization. So I was always pushing these ideas that I thought were important for the public to consume. And part of what is amazing about that place and what is terrible is the fact that it is surrounded on 3 sides by the Sedgwick County Jail.
Yeah.
That the symbolism there is very powerful. However, before I left, I had identified a new location, and my successor was able to secure that building. So in a couple of years, the museum will have a new dignified home on Main Street in Wichita, downtown, which is basically, I consider Main Street, our front lawn. And so what I considered, in my humble opinion, the greatest institution in that city is now going to be on Main Street. And it'll have a place where we can adequately and properly take care of that collection, which is assessed at more than $1 million. There's some fine art in that place, as well as some fine people who are really making things happen there. I couldn't be prouder of that place.
It's a great place. And I'm so excited about the new place that's coming. It's going to be such a blessing to this state and to the lives of Kansas. So, Mark, before Pastor Cheryl has a question she's going to ask you in just a moment. But before she asks that question, just tell us a bit about what you're working on now. And I know one thing you just recently worked on, a documentary of one famous Kansan. But what are you working on these days? And tell folks a little about the documentary that came out a couple of months ago.
Well, I'm pretty much done with that project now. But I wrote a book with Barry Sanders, the Hall of Fame running back. We went all the way through school together. We met on the kindergarten bus. We've been friends ever since.
Oh, wow.
And 20 years ago, we put a book out because the way he left professional football left a lot of people stunned. And they had a lot of questions. And we thought, since 20 years had passed and a lot had changed in his life, it'd probably be a good idea to re-release the book and update it. So we updated it, and it has some new features. You know, his mom has been running a vacation Bible school for 40 years. And there was a reunion of all the kids, and it was an amazing reunion. All the kids came back. One of the kids there was one kid in particular who was kind of mischievous, and he came back, and he was a pastor. And I'm sure his mom was just so proud of that. But you know, we were all packed into that living room in the summer, listening to Mrs. Sanders and listening to Barry's sister Nancy, to whom the book was dedicated. And then in addition to that book project, there was a documentary being done by NFL Films, and it was more about his life, but the film and the re-released book have the same title, Bye Bye Barry. And we've been fortunate. The documentary is the most streamed documentary ever on Amazon.
Wow.
That sound effect was appropriate. I mean, yeah.
I don't know who did that sound, but it was appropriate.
You want me to say it again and maybe it'll happen again? But yeah, so the documentary is wonderful. The same man who did the previous documentary about Barry for NFL Films did this one. And I can tell you this, and it won't give anything away, but you should watch the last few scenes where Barry is in London talking to his sons as they ask him questions about why he left the game. It's just so beautiful and wholesome. And it really speaks to the kind of man he is. And that's what I was more interested in, people learning what kind of person he was, because, you know, when people who have that kind of talent, people just think of them as a talent and nothing else. But this is a man of great depth, great faith, and great intelligence that he doesn't get any credit for. And I think all of that comes through in the documentary. So thank you for letting me talk about that as well.
Thank you for sharing that.
That's really interesting, Mark. A couple of things. We know each other from when I lived in the Wichita area. I moved in '85, and so love the museum. I went there, you know, a few times when I was in the area, and appreciate all the work you've done. And then I'm originally from Detroit.
Oh,
So
wow.
Barry, you know, ended up, there's a huge plaque or painting on the side of a building downtown of him. And so I was just to hear that connection between the two of you is really interesting. So my duty is to ask you, before you share about Kansas and Missouri history, is if you would share with us your bullet lists of the top 15 most important African-American moments. And if you got to give detail, it's okay.
Okay. So I'm talking about moments here, not people.
Right.
But there were some people that I thought didn't make the list, but they were others receiving votes, like they do in college football and college basketball. On my others receiving votes would be Jawanza Kunjufu, the author who wrote Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. He wrote that series in the 80s. He's an educator who had found innovative ways that African-American children could and should be taught. Asa Hilliard is another historian. He was an Egyptologist. He was also an early proponent of driving this kind of content in public school curriculum. Sheikh Anta Diop is also another author. He wrote the book, The African Origins of Civilization. Chancellor Williams, Francis Cress Welsing, Gordon Parks, John Heinrich Clark. Those are people who I think just missed my list. And this is a good exercise because I really struggled with it, to just confine it to the 15. But I thought that Gregor Mendel, the geneticist, was very important. He was the person who talked about recessive genes and dominant genes. That helped me with a lot of my understanding of history. I thought the integration of Central High School was also very important. When President Eisenhower, who calls Kansas home, even though he was born in Texas, when he sent those troops into Little Rock, he was breaking a very old, basically standoff. There hadn't been federal troops in the South since Reconstruction. When he sent those troops in so that those kids could go to Central High, that was a very important moment for the country. Just like Emmett Till's lynching was very important to the country. It electrified the movement in a way that's hard for people nowadays to really understand. John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry was also very, very important. Harriet Tubman was supposed to be there, but fell ill. That was the only reason that she wasn't there. The Brown decision was the first time that the government acknowledged the damage that was being done through segregation. And I would include in that Dr. Kenneth Clark and his doll experiment. I thought that was eye-opening for the country. And it also, again, reiterates what was happening to people just by separating them. You were harming people by treating them differently. I'd also include the decision written by Judge Taney in the Dred Scott decision, where he said that Black people had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. It was a seminal moment in the country. Reconstruction and the Civil War, also very important. And the last person I wanted to talk about was a man named John Punch. He was an enslaved African who escaped with 2 white indentured servants. When they were all captured, the white indentured servants had 3 years added to their indenture. John Punch was sentenced to the balance of his natural life. And a lot of historians, including my friend Sean Alexander at the University of Kansas, says this is the first instance in law where we're treating white people one way and Black people another way.
Wow.
And then I would add to that Bacon's Rebellion, which was a similar kind of uprising where white indentured servants and Black slaves, enslaved people, rose up. And when they did that, it sent shockwaves, not just through Virginia, all the way across the water back to England, that if these 2 groups ever came together, we would not be able to contain that group. And that also began a policy of treating white people one way, Black people a different way. There are a few others that I'd like to mention, like Maulana Karenga, who created Kwanzaa. And it was not Black Christmas, but it was like a return to our values, that we had a culture and values issue that we needed to resolve in the culture. And that was his intent. Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, but I'll stop there.
Wow. Great stuff. Great stuff. So I got a couple of questions that we didn't plan. Surprise,
Surprise.
Surprise. So Mark, and I know I can ask you this, and I know that you, because I know you, but talk about the historical debates that happened between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, that historical debate, the significance of that, and how you think that their ideological differences have played out in the.
I actually had intended to include Booker T. Washington on my list. He's important because he established an institution that is still around. That's difficult. Yeah, that's difficult. And anyone who's done that needs to be lifted up. The debate between Du Bois and Booker T is interesting. There's an aspect of this where Booker T was being practical, but W.B. Du Bois was thinking on a different level. He felt like to have anything in this culture, you had to have resources, you had to have money, and you had to have a system that you controlled. Booker T was much more practical in his approach. He felt like if we could be left alone, we could cast our bucket down where we were. That he said that in a famous speech. I actually have that speech on my phone. You cast your bucket down where you were and help yourself. And that is a debate that we're still having in Black communities today. To what degree should we do this? To what degree should we do that? It's always been my wish that they could have found a way to create some synergy between the two of them. But that didn't happen. There were other things at play there between the two of them, but that's just a summary.
How similar do you think there was any connection between the historical debate between Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X?
Man, what an interesting question. So there's a new book out, or relatively new book out, by Peniel Joseph, and he talks about Malcolm X and Dr. King, and he talks about Malcolm X as our prosecuting attorney, the attorney who prosecutes people who harmed us. Dr. King was our defense attorney.
That's a great metaphor. Keep going.
Yeah, I thought it was wonderful. What's interesting, though, brother, is that both of them were killed at about the time in their lives where they had expanded the group of people that they wanted to reach. You know, Malcolm had left the nation.
Yeah.
He had created the Organization of African American Unity, and anybody could join. He had made the Hajj, and he had prayed with blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims, and he was going to reject all of the racial rhetoric that was really what he was all about when he was speaking for the nation and Elijah Muhammad. Dr. King, shortly before his death, was one of the most unpopular people in the country. He had a 75% disapproval rating, and he had a 55% disapproval rating among African Americans. Wow. Because people were telling him, why don't you stay focused on civil rights?
Yeah.
Why don't you try to help us get rid of segregation? You're talking about the war and all this other stuff. But as soon as you become international in your view, apparently you become a very dangerous person. When you love poor people to the degree both of those people did, you become a very dangerous person. So those two and Fred Hampton, they were all killed just as they were making these overtures to the larger community. And there again, it takes you back to Bacon's rebellion, that if you could keep the Black working class and the white working class separate, you can rule. And we're still bouncing up against that today.
Wow. Great stuff. Co-host, jump in. Any thoughts, questions for Mark before we?
I was hoping if we could have access to your list, because I heard the names, and if we can get that would be great.
Sure. One person that I should have mentioned was Ida B. Wells, was one of my heroes, and my professor at the University of Kansas was the curator of the Ida B. Wells Award. And so he took me, one of his little students, with him when he would meet all these industry titans, like Milton Coleman at the Washington Post got the Ida B. Wells Award one year, and I got to go meet him. And he found out that I was working at the newspaper in Wichita, and I had an impromptu job interview in his suite. Where I got to interview with the Washington Post because I was with Daddy Sam. But Ida B. Wells was an incredible journalist. She was fearless. What I remember most are the pieces that she wrote about her friends in Memphis, her friend in Memphis who had a grocery store. And it was very successful. In fact, it was so successful that he was nearly putting out the white grocery store. He was putting the white grocery store out of business. And so a plan was concocted to loot and burn it and kill him. And it happened. And she wrote about it. And she wrote about all the lynchings to try and raise the consciousness of the country. Just an incredible, incredible person. So, I mean, if you keep giving me opportunities, I'm going to keep going back to this list.
No, we keep going back to the list. And as you give those names, I'm going to try to type them in.
No, I'll send them later. I have them written down.
More about Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells, you know, in terms of she led the movement, to the anti-lynching movement at one time. I can't remember the stats, the number of African Americans who were being lynched unjustly, without due process of law in this country. And it was Ida B. Wells that led the anti-lynching movement.
Yes.
And as we approach March, Women's History Month, she was also a big proponent of women's rights.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Just an incredible person all around.
Okay. Other thoughts, questions from the host?
I appreciate you reminding us of the approval or disapproval rating of the Reverend Dr. King and his time, because that's something that usually gets glossed over. And the way that we lift him up and celebrate him now is so different than it was in the time. And even the way that he is celebrated now, I have just learned to take a cue from his daughter. So Dr. Bernice King, she's the CEO of the King Center in Atlanta. And she always, the week coming up to Dr. Martin Luther King Day, she's always posting, like almost every day, honor my father in this way. Don't just quote him out of context. And so she always just gives, like every year, a good reminder of, you know, he was killed for a reason. I mean, there's something that was going on at that time. So give some context to as we.
Could I share a poem?
Yes.
That's frequently attributed to being about Dr. King. It's by Carl Wendell Hines Jr. It's called A Dead Man's Dream. He said, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him, build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes, for they cannot rise to challenge the images that we might fashion from their lives. And besides, it's easier to build monuments than it is to build a better world. So now that he is safely dead, we with eased consciences will tell our children that he was a great man, knowing that the cause for which he lived is still a cause, and the dream for which he died is still a dream, a dead man's dream. That was written not for Dr. King. It was written for Malcolm X. It was written in the aftermath of his death.
Wow.
And it seemed to apply so beautifully to Dr. King that over time it's become associated with him. But it was really about Malcolm.
Wow.
So there was some real symmetry in the question that you had asked earlier about, you know, the debate between Malcolm and Martin. And one of the best plays I'd ever seen is called The Meeting, where the two of them meet in in a hotel room and then just debate. If you ever get a chance to see it, you ought to check it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Great stuff, Pastor Ashley. Thank you. Mark, thank you for sharing that poem. Right. So Mark, mention how important in your mind, what's your reflection on the Reconstruction period and then the post-Reconstruction?
Wow, what a good question. I think it was the beginning of a terrible, terrible pattern. Black progress in this country gets punished. So during Reconstruction, African Americans were making all these inroads. They were, being elected to office, opening businesses, But after a while, people in the South got restless. And when it was overturned, there were decades and decades of violence, unspeakable violence and terrorism visited on African Americans. We get to the Civil Rights Movement. There are advances. 12 years after Dr. King is killed, is a conservative revolution rolling back, attempting to roll back civil rights gains. The advancement of an African American president. What did we get? We got perhaps his exact opposite. And we got January 6th.
Yeah.
That black progress in the country gets punished. And I had a conversation with a young person recently, and it was an earnest, almost pleading question from this young lady. What did African Americans ever do to be hated so? And it seems like we're hated in every community. There's anti-blackness everywhere, even in our own community. We treat people who are different shades different, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me that in the larger community, African Americans become the focus of such vitriol because we challenge the fundamental narrative about the country. Remember James Baldwin, who said, there's scarcely any hope for the American dream because the people among us who are denied it, by their very presence, will wreck it. We reflect all of the nation's difficulties to some folk. And we can either, in terms of human nature, avoid something, control it, or destroy it. And we don't really understand the country that we've been given. And it's getting worse and worse. I remember being in high school and having to take civics. And now when you watch those late night shows, there are people who can't name the 3 branches of government. They don't know who the president is. I mean, there are people who don't know who the president is. They don't know who their representatives are.
Yeah.
I'm talking about their federal ones. There's a real disconnect there. And I wish that there was more that we can do, but I think programs like this, where people have opportunities to have these discussions that can be very difficult. They shouldn't be. We're only talking about, our history. But sadly, in this country, what we prefer is nostalgia, not history. We're nostalgic about everything, but we really don't want to know that all that history. One of the people that I put on my list that I didn't mention, that's a good example of this, Robert, is the slave breaker. When we were in school, we learned about the slave trader, and we learned about the ships, and we learned about the slave owner. But we didn't talk about the stop that the people who were enslaved had to make in the Caribbean, where their spirits were literally beaten out of them in front of their families to prepare them to be servants. And if you think about this as well, when the Constitution was written, it was written by a minority. African enslaved people and indigenous people far outnumbered everyone in this country when the Constitution was written. So it was a minority document. It was a minority document. And it makes numerous references to slavery. I mean, there's a reference to fugitive slaves, not as people, but as property that must be returned. And that's ultimately what pulled the country apart during the Civil War. So, I mean, I'll leave it there because I'll go off on a deeper tangent, but I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes, absolutely. Host, you want to jump in? And yes, we are, LaDonna. We're about to get directly into Kansas history. I was saving that for Kansas history. Absolutely. I just wanted to hear Mark, because I just know he's such a scholar on this stuff, historian. on on national history. Let's turn now to Kansas history, Mark, and let's talk about. So before we do that, will you, if you could do dinner with one African American from American history, if you could do dinner with one person, who would it be and why? If you could do dinner and ask and probe the mind of one person from African American history, who would that person be?
It'd probably be Dr. Kenneth Clark. No, not Kenneth Clark. I mean, he's on my list here. John Heinrich Clark.
John Heinrich Clark,
the historian.
And why?
He'd be my favorite. He'd be. This was someone who was not formally trained, but had such insights where he was able to take our history and our experience and merge them in the way that he taught. And he understood human nature as well. He's fascinating. And one of my favorite quotes is attributed to him, where he talks about the power of just knowing yourself and your own history makes you unconquerable. It's not about the weapons that you have. It's the knowledge that you have of yourself that will dictate your station in life. And in that regard, I just want to be next to that. I just want to be next to that. And he was just so knowledgeable. Such a beautiful brother.
Great choice. Hey, before I like to ask our host that same question. If you could co-host, if you could pick one person from African American history to spend an evening with, who would it be, and why?
Well,
You're muted.
Sorry about that. I would like to just spend some time with Malcolm X and just figure out what was he thinking, what was going on, what prompted him to be who he was and so outspoken.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's all of, I mean, if, as Christians, we believe in transformation. Mm-hmm. That brother transformed himself inside out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Pastor Cheryl?
That's a hard one. I have to give it a little bit more thought. I don't know.
Pastor Ashley?
So I noticed that you didn't say dead or alive, right?
Yeah. Don't have to be, dead or...
Will you let me break the rule?
Dead or alive? Dead or alive? Who just, your choice.
Did you hear me? Would you let me break the rule of one?
Yeah, yes, sure.
All right. So the first thing that comes, so I talked about Dr. King because I lived in Atlanta for 3 years, and that city is so impacted by him and such rich history. So of course I'd want to sit and have dinner with him. But then I think of St. Louis. I went to undergrad near St. Louis and had a connection at the time to the Jackie Joyner Kersey Center. And so spent a lot of time learning about her life, and she was amazing. So that would be super fun. But then dead or alive, right? I was thinking, who would not hang out with the Obamas and just hear about their experience? So thanks for letting me bend the rule.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotta go back to Pastor.
I think she's ready to jump in.
I'm going down a personal road. I would like to spend time with my great-great-grandfather, who was a co-founder of Morehouse. And and
Wow.
he did and founded churches. His son founded churches in Atlanta. Atlanta is my home base. So what Ashley shared kind of prompted me to think about that, my own family, just
Right.
we don't we haven't really passed the stories down like we should have. We don't do a good job. At least my family hasn't always done a good job of that. So
Cheryl, you doggone right. You haven't passed the story down. How do we not know that? How the heck? See. Those, y'all, please don't call Adam and say Robert was cussing on.
Well, I'm telling.
Pastor Cheryl is Black education royalty.
Yes.
HBCU royalty.
Your great grandfather?
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
That is a wow.
We're gonna have
William
to call
J.
her
White.
Princess Pastor.
That is absolutely awesome.
Yeah. And I've got some this ain't about me anyway, but I've got 3 Tuskegee Airmen that are in my lineage as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
A funny story. There was a Tuskegee Airman in Wichita.
Yeah.
And we were at a dinner, and he was there. And so I wanted to get a picture of him and my family together. And we had this nice picture. And then my baby twin, Morgan, photobombs by closing his eyes and giving a thumbs up like this in the picture.
Oh, yes.
I actually met that guy. I went to go visit some members. Well, that was one particular member, and her sisters took me over there. Marilyn Overton. Overton.
Yeah.
Marilyn was my favorite.
So the oldest sister, she was in this. Imadale was in a
Imadale.
So Marilyn and Pearline took me over there to meet her and to fellowship. We were hanging out, and this guy comes on. He's on the second upper level on the and he goes, "Hey, are you that new pastor at St. Mark?" And I look up, and it's this older guy, and I was like, "Yeah." And he says, "You got one daughter who's at Spelman," and I was like, "Yeah." And he says, "You got another daughter who went to Howard, and now she lives in LA." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "I want to meet the one that's the filmmaker. When she comes to Wichita, I want to meet her." And the sisters are just laughing. They're just laughing because they see this look on my face like, who is this guy who knows all my family? Like who? And they said, he's a Tuskegee Airman.
Yeah.
And he reads the paper. He remembers all the details, and that he read the article about you arriving at St. Mark. And he had remembered all the details about my daughter's age, where they went to school, and he stood there on second, third floor of that building and was just spouting all these details out. It was absolutely amazing. He died a couple years ago, right? Didn't he pass away? Right. That's right.
He did. Yeah, just an incredible person. And from a generation, I just noticed this about the generation. Nowadays, if you're on Facebook or any social media, people are constantly taking pictures of themselves and constantly elevating themselves, all this humble bragging.
Wow.
This man was a Tuskegee Airman, and we had an event, centering him at the museum. And I'm a professional interviewer. I could not get him to talk about all of his accomplishments.
Wow.
Every question that I put to him, no, I didn't do anything great. I just did what I was supposed to do. It was just like that. And it was frustrating in the moment, but it said a lot to me about his character.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I really wish there was more of that today. And, you remember Frank DeFord, the sports writer?
Yeah. Yeah.
He said, we have gone from, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And then we went to winning is everything. And now it's in your face.
Yeah.
And what he represented was a throwback to, I think, a better time for us.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's really helpful, Mark, because earlier I was saying how our family didn't pass down the history, and so it wasn't about bragging, even though it was grounds maybe for bragging, but that humility and humbleness
Yes.
being exhibited. So thank you
Yeah.
for that
Yeah.
perspective. Amen.
Yes.
Kind of like this pastor I know whose great great grandfather helped to found Morehouse College, and
She was an electrical engineer from
electrical engineer.
Georgia State and the Georgia Tech.
Got
We got Mark here. We
Yeah.
got Mark here. Let's go back to the list. Let's go back to the list.
No, I'm not. Oh, I'm
So,
nowhere close to what you've done.
So
I do
Mark,
wanna say, though,
let's go to Kansas. Let's jump into
yeah,
Kansas.
I do want to say though that I have a good friend who is from Nicodemus. I have a couple of friends who are from Nicodemus,
Yeah.
and if you ever get a chance,
So
to
tell
hear-
people, give
to hear
context.
this lady talk, you
There are
got to hear her. Her name is Angela Bates,
Yeah.
and Angela tells this story about where the people from Nicodemus came from. These were enslaved people, enslaved in Kentucky. One of the enslaved women had become the wife of a former vice president of the United States, who had married her, divorced her, and then married her sister.
Wow.
And the progeny, including some people from Tennessee and others, they started moving west. And the westward movement meant freedom. It meant it meant the promised land to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people who believe that Nicodemus was named for a character in the Bible, but it was actually named from an African prince who had been enslaved and purchased his freedom.
Wow.
That's why they named it that. And it's a national it's on the national, it's a national park. And there's a huge event there every summer for Emancipation Day.
So Mark,
since the place was established.
So Mark, you gotta pause, because you are either Pastor Cheryl, one of you guys. So that for folks who are listening, because there are folks who are listening that they're learning this Black history, some of this history, they're hearing it for the first time. They're here because they want to learn, because they realize that they didn't get exposed to Black history. Tell folks, what is Nicodemus? So let's talk. What is Nicodemus?
It's an all-Black town in northwest Kansas, not too far from the Colorado border.
And why was it an all-Black town? And what's this? Tell more of the story about it.
Well, again, it was established by enslaved people primarily from Lexington, Kentucky, who left, moving west in search of the promised land, in search of freedom. And at the time, people were telling African Americans around the country, "Hey, come to Kansas, come to Kansas, come to Kansas." There was an African American man named Pap Singleton who was telling people, "Hey, come to Kansas." Well, strangely, when they arrived, they found out that Kansas was anti-slavery and was prepared to take up arms to make sure that we were not a slave territory. That, this idea of popular sovereignty, we were going to vote and then determine, That didn't necessarily mean that they wanted African Americans, though. They didn't. And so consequently, some of the punishments that people received for coming here were more harsh, because the idea was for them to go back and tell others how bad it was here so they would not come.
Wow.
But where Nicodemus was established up in northwest Kansas, they just stopped there, and it was by a river. And interestingly, there was a biracial group of people who helped establish the town. It was very interesting. It had an African American face, and then there was another town nearby that was white, had a white face.
Wow.
In terms of leadership.
Right.
And it still exists. And as I said, there's a big Emancipation Day event there. There's a 100-year-old Emancipation Day event in Hutchinson, Kansas.
Is that right? I did.
There is.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
It's amazing. If you ever get a chance, you should go to both.
So, Mark, tell me, how was there a parallel between a place like Nicodemus, Kansas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, in terms of being places that were all black?
That happened in the purge that you're talking about. There was a purge that happened in Coffeyville. There was a purge that happened in El Dorado. And this was really interesting. So
in El Dorado, Kansas?
Yes. Yeah, people may not remember this, but President Obama's mother was born in Wichita. And about the time that I came back to the museum for the second time, there was a historian at Wichita State named Jay Price. Jay has become a good friend of mine. And Jay had discovered not just his Barack's mom's lineage, but had done a lot of research about her parents. And they lived in El Dorado for a while, and they lived in Ark City for a while. But if you go back, well, if you read a book called This Is Not Dixie, Racial Violence in Kansas, it is a catalog of all the horrible things that happened to African Americans who moved to the state. And Coffeyville was one that is referenced in the book, and so is El Dorado. But essentially, the Black population was attacked and ran out of town. It was Rosewood, it was Tulsa. There were numerous examples of this. And what people don't understand is that, you know, this might even still be true, but say you owned a piece of property and you were African American and you were next to someone who was white and they ran you off the property. All they had to do was pay the taxes on that for a certain number of years, and then it was deeded over to you. So there was a reason that African Americans had land and were being prosperous, and then all of a sudden, no prosperity, no land, and terrorism drove them north.
Yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, so I will share with you guys, in my own family, my maternal grandfather experienced that very thing. He owned some land in Mississippi. He had what they called a running tab at a local store. Mm. And he would pay on that tab. And my mom and my aunts say that their mother would say to him, Clarence, you need to get receipts for what. And he's like, no, he trusts the guy. We know him, they know us. And he never would get receipts for payments he was making. And so this goes on. And so one night they show up, the store owner and a couple of guys with him, and basically say, you haven't paid your tab, time's up. Turn over the deeds to your land. And basically he ends up, resisting. But then after the resistance, he knows that he has to get out of town. He knows he has to leave, or that kind of thing.
He had no recourse. Where was he going to go?
Had no recourse. So when you look at the ownership, like throughout, particularly in the South, you look at the people who own property, and people act as if African Americans don't own land because they're not industrious, because they're not smart, because they don't have a clue about owning. No, they did own land. It was taken away. That's right. That's right.
Just taken.
So we experienced that in our own family. Yeah.
Well, one other thing I wanted to point out, and now we're getting to the kind of the heart of the discussion. I have argued for maybe the last 15, 20 years thereabout, that Kansas serves as the nation's fault line, social fault line. Where I am right now, here in Kansas City, was where the Civil War ostensibly began. The border war between Kansas and Missouri, fired by John Brown, the attack on Lawrence, the fuse of the Civil War was lit here. We have incredible civil rights history. There was a double V campaign victory at home over racism, victory abroad over fascism. That began in Wichita when a cafeteria worker at Boeing, you know anything about that, Pastor? About Boeing? Yeah, so he was a cafeteria worker and he wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. And the Pittsburgh Courier was an African-American newspaper. It circulated nationally. So if you were in a Black community somewhere, there's probably a few copies of the Pittsburgh Courier laying around. Well, he wrote that, you know, we got to fight. If we're going to go over there and fight for other people's rights, we should fight for our rights here at home. And the Pittsburgh Courier made that a campaign. And before you knew it, there were double V parades, double V beauty pageants, double V gardens all over the country. And it began in Wichita. The first successful student-led sit-in was in 1958, 18 months before the more famous ones in Greensboro. It happened in Wichita. Dr. King referenced the Dockham sit-in of 1958.
Yeah.
And then if you're talking also about issues like abortion, the Summer of Mercy in the early 1990s, 25,000 people were arrested. I mean, it was a pivot point in politics, in who we are as a society. It was a pivot point. It just seems like every major movement had to stop here in Kansas. Kansas was the first state to go into adopt prohibition, temperance, the temperance movement. If you know anything about Carrie Nation and her little axe, and she was going around destroying bars. They even had women attack her and beat her up, and she'd come right back and try to get that place closed down. I mean, so Kansas is indispensable in any discussion about African American history. You got Gordon Parks, who was a trailblazer in terms of photography, in terms of cinema. I mean, his film Shaft helped save Hollywood. People had stopped going to the movies. And then he comes out with Shaft and it's a box office success. We also have, Aaron Douglas, the mural artist, was part of the Harlem Renaissance. We talked about Langston Hughes earlier. He was an iconic figure of the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is not just about art. One of the names of the Harlem Renaissance was the New Negro Movement. This was us trying to redefine ourselves after years of minstrel shows and vaudeville. We are beautiful people. We are intelligent people. That was the whole point of the movement. And you had a Kansan at the center of it. And when I used to belong to a lot of museum organizations, and whenever we were talking to people, you know, where you're from, Pastor, you know, Mississippi and places like that, that are more familiar, they were shocked at the role Kansas played. I mean, even up to today, we wouldn't have the new museum, the new Smithsonian Museum, but for Kansas. Because when Governor Brownback was Senator Brownback, he and John Lewis wrote the respective bills in their respective houses that created it. And Kansas had more people on that original board than any other state. We had 4 people.
Wow.
One of them was Linwood Sexton's son, Eric,
Wow.
who was appointed by the president. How about that? So, I mean, people think of us as flyover country, but this was a theater of incredible drama in our story.
Wow. So much rich stuff. Let's pause. Questions, feedback from our co-host. Great stuff, Mark. Wow. Like, I didn't know. I will tell you that until
I feel like I've talked everybody's ear off.
No, it's all good, Mark. It's all good. Thank you.
Oh, I can go on. Dr. King's lawyer was born in Wichita, a man named Donald Hollowell. Donald Hollowell used to try cases in rural Georgia in front of all white juries, and he would somehow win. When Dr. King was put in Reedsville prison, Donald Hollowell and the Kennedys helped him get out of prison. He also represented Julian Bond and John Lewis. And he helped integrate the University of Georgia. So if you've ever heard of the journalist Charlene Hunter Galt, the lawyer from Wichita, Don Hollowell, is the man who won the case against the University of Georgia that got her admitted. And late in life, he was blind, and I got to meet him. And so I landed in the Atlanta airport, and I called him. I'd rented a car, and he said, "Where are you?" And I told him where I was. And this, I wish I was, I'm telling you the absolute truth here. I'm not exaggerating in the least. He gave me turn-by-turn directions as a blind man, how to get to his house. Every stoplight, every stop sign, every turn, he knew it. It's just an incredible guy. People used to put ladders on the windows at the county courthouse just to watch him work, and they called him Dear Attorney.
Wow. And then give us that name again, Mark.
Don Hollowell. Charles McAfee, the architect, still alive, born on Christmas Day in Wichita. His daughter runs his Atlanta office. And before she left Wichita, she was trying to find work there. And she had an architectural degree, I think, from Harvard. But the biggest project she could get in Wichita was a fire station way out north of town. That's all the work that she could get. When she opened that Atlanta office, she won the contract to build all of the Olympic venues for the Atlanta Olympics.
Wow. Great stuff.
It's really something. She had to leave Wichita to get that kind of an opportunity. But yeah, he also built the Wichita Eagles building, which has recently been torn down and replaced by Cargill.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, he got that deal. I mean, it was a big deal. And he's a fraternity brother of Don Hollowell. That's how I found out about Don Hollowell. Yeah. They were both in Kappa Alpha Psi.
I learned about Don Hollowell from a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell, which I recommend that all of you listening go back to season 1. Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast called Revisionist History. If you go to season 1, and he talks about a civil rights, the story of a civil rights attorney and a story that happens there, and this is the gentleman that he talks about. Mark, you told me a fascinating story, and I'd like for you to share this story. When the Emmett Till incident happened, and of course it was an impetus that happens in 54, I believe, 55. The movement in Montgomery happens in 57. So, and it was an impetus. Dr. King referred to that incident, the Emmett Till incident, as an impetus for him, even in terms of.
But don't forget about James Reeb. James Reeb was a white Universalist Unitarian minister. He was born in Wichita. He was living in Boston, and he was watching the news when Bloody Sunday was being reported. You know, the beatings on the Edmund Pettus Bridge there in Selma. And Dr. King made a nationwide plea to clergy, all clergy, come and march with me. We want to complete this march. Mr. Reeb, Reverend Reeb, left his family, his wife and his kids, and he went there for the march. And this was going to be the turnaround march, where Dr. King was about to march into the teeth of these people who were carrying baseball bats with barbed wire wrapped around them. And he knelt and prayed and said, I cannot move forward. I cannot see any more bloodshed. And he turned around and went back. Well, after a meeting at the church that night, Reeb and two other clergymen got lost in Selma. They made a wrong turn. And people recognized them as people who were pushing for voting rights. And one of them hit Reverend Reeb over the head with a club. And when they took him to the hospital in Selma, he was there fighting for Black people's rights, so they wouldn't treat him. They had to send him far away, and he died 2 days later from those injuries. Dr. King gave his eulogy, and his death helped usher in the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
That's right. That's right.
That's Kansas history. There is a monument to a Wichitan in Selma, Alabama. And when we took a tour there, we wore shirts that said "Justice for James Reeb," because one of the men that had killed him owned a used car lot there and had never been convicted.
Wow.
So we went back and forth past his place with our shirts on.
Wow. Wow. Well, Mark, you got to tell this story. This is where I was headed. When the Emmett Till deal happens, there were some attorneys from Wichita.
Oh,
yes, that went to Mississippi. Tell that story, and
Yeah.
about the impact of what their experience of being there, and the fear and the.
This is someone else who should have been on my list. You're talking about Chester I. Lewis, who was born in Hutchinson, went to the University of Kansas and got his law degree. He was the head of the NAACP. And in this period of time that you're talking about, he and several other NAACP branch presidents visited Mississippi. They just kind of wanted to see what was happening there. And he in particular was not ready. They were trying to go to one of the voting precincts. And when they pulled up, there were lines of people there with their cops with their hands on their pistols. And he experienced so much terror on that trip that when he returned, Gretchen Ike talks about this in her book, Descent in Wichita. But when he got home, he wouldn't come out of his room for 2 weeks. He was just so overcome with the violence, the terrorism, all of that stuff that was happening in Mississippi at the time. And I guess people knew about it because he had kind of weekly discussions with media. It was almost like an informal press conference. But he didn't show up for 2 weeks because he wouldn't leave his room for 2 weeks. He was just so overwhelmed by what he saw.
Wow.
And this is someone who did a lot of integrating work. He integrated a lot of the aerospace company floors there in Wichita. And I know that just because my dad worked in those places. And when he needed to integrate someplace, my dad was helping him find people who had the skills to go and work in those places. And they used to go hunting together.
Wow. All right. So it is 8:15. I want to give a chance. Those of you that are listening, if you have some questions you want to send to us, and we'll try to get those to Mark. If you have questions or comments, please share those with us. Tom Ventura, thank you so much for sharing your comment. I agree with you. Mark is brilliant. We've got to do a broadcast with both Mark and Dr. Shana together. That would be absolutely amazing if we could get the two of them on here together. And also our good friend over at tell them, and we want to. I'm going to try to do a special episode of this, maybe in March. Bring us back together for one more special episode, even though we'll be past Black History, but to bring on your friend from Kansas KU. Yeah,
Sean Lee Alexander. He is the head of the African American Studies Department at the University of Kansas. He's also the head of the Langston Hughes Center there as well. This is a brilliant guy. The story I told you about John Punch, I learned last night from him.
Wow.
He was speaking at a Black History event at the Dole Center on the KU campus, and I caught it. And he was also a peer reviewer for the 1619 project.
Wow.
I mean,
wow.
That's top to me. But he always has some kind of unique take. For instance, when he was talking about John Punch, he also mentioned that there was, and I can't remember this gentleman's name for the life of me, but he went to Sumner High School here, which was an all-black high school here in Kansas City. And when he was at Kansas, he could not be a part of the marching band because it was segregated. So he ended up at Florida A&M. He became a rattler. You know, they do that there, rattler. And the halftime shows where the bands are dancing and they're playing like contemporary music began with him.
Wow.
It's just, when I was in newspapers, when I was in daily newspapers, and there was some sort of international incident, plane crash or something, invariably there was a Kansan involved almost every time. Like I was saying that we were the social fault line for the country. It just seems like there was always something happening here in Kansas. There was some Kansan. You know, Oscar Michaud, the African-American filmmaker, is buried here in Kansas near Great Bend.
Wow.
You could just go on and on about all these incredible people that we've produced. Yeah. And we don't get our due.
Yeah.
We don't get our due.
Very true.
Even Marion Barry, who, you know,
yeah.
But he was a chemistry TA at the University of Kansas.
Yeah.
And so freedom writer. And you know, before, you know, he destroyed his career, he had an incredible resume. So, I mean, the connections to Kansas those connections have always fascinated me.
Fascinating. Mark, talk about two people that I think have Kansas connections. I don't know if they were born here, but I think they have some. George Washington Carver. Is that correct?
He wasn't born in Kansas, but he did live here. He lived in Minneapolis, Kansas, and I think he lived somewhere in Southeast Kansas as well. Iowa State University named their School of Engineering after him.
To George Washington Carver, who in my opinion is one of them, even though he gets some measure of recognition and celebration, he is still so underrated as a scientist.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
You know, he's reduced to the peanut.
That's right.
And what people don't understand is that what he was doing was crop rotation.
Right. He taught
nitrogen back in the soil.
He taught it, Mark.
We were through the cotton, raising cotton, we were stripping the soil. And by doing crop rotation, you could replenish the soil. He saved Southern agriculture.
That's right.
But all we know about him is peanuts and peanut butter. And you have this image of this man, this crazy scientist in his office eating peanuts, smashing peanuts. But there was really something powerful that he was doing. And as I said, this man rescued Southern agriculture with the idea of crop rotation. As a matter of fact, another fact about him, Mark, when he and John Ford were good friends, when John Ford began to think about mass production of cars, he actually went and had discussions with George Washington Carver, his good friend, who took the concept of mass production of produce and really gave him ideas about how to reproduce that in terms of manufacturing. So that counts for him. But yeah, he saved the Southern croppers and taught them how to rotate crops. Just the other story about him that I think is so phenomenal. So when I compare him to the other great scientists in American history, all the other folks, when Booker T. Washington brought George Washington Carver and told him, hey, come, I've got this school here. I want you to come and start a science lab and teach kids science. He gets to the school and there are absolutely no resources to start a science laboratory. This is a true story. So he sends his kids out into the local fields and streets and tells them to collect anything, bottle tops, paper clips, just anything you find.
And they said, why are we doing this? And he says, we're building our first science lab. So like when you think about the guys the other brilliant scientists that we celebrate in American history who were at Harvard, right? Who were at Harvard and Yale and all these, this dude is at their level with no resources and is starting a science lab with bottle tops that were found on the street. It's just an amazing story. Amazing.
Well, I mean, again, bro, that was an era where if you had achieved to that level, you had a responsibility to everyone else.
Yeah.
Now it's all for me.
It's all for me. It's all for me. It's all for me. And how quickly I can get my picture on Instagram. My wife, if I can't believe Linda's not, she must not be feeling it because she be on here amening you about this social media right now and about how everybody runs the social media.
I don't want to condemn people because I think there's an epidemic of loneliness in the culture.
Yeah.
For sure. And that social media is just kind of a salve.
Yeah.
And we don't have like closeness.
Yeah.
Like we should have. There's something about our culture that is pushing us outward. You know, this is why I'm sitting here today, because fewer people are reading newspapers, right? And if you put a map, if you had a tracing of newspaper readership, and then you had another tracing of voting and who's not, you could put them right on top of each other.
Yeah.
Because as newspaper readership declined, so did voting.
Wow.
And I had an editor who was on the cutting edge of this question. And what he was arguing was that we'd gotten really good at telling people about all the problems that we have, but we were never offering any solutions. So it was problem after problem after problem. And pretty soon people said, enough. I just want to come home. I'm going to drive right into my garage. I'm going to close the door and I'm going to go in. So they started pulling back from civic culture. We need people in civic culture. I mean, only about 10 or 15%, maybe 20% of people who should be voting are voting. We're just talking about registered voters. I mean, there are people who have never registered. And we can't be a true democracy unless everybody's involved. Democracy isn't just about voting. It's about belonging. And people don't feel like they belong anymore. So we got to pull people in all manners. And people have to have a stake in the country to care about it. That's why inequality in the country is just so important for us to pay attention to. It's like a game of Monopoly. Once everybody has all the money, the game is over.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Mark, one more person I want, and then we'll get some final comments or questions from our co-hosts and any of you, our audience. If you guys have some thoughts to share, please do in the comments. If you have questions for Mark, please share. We've got only a couple of more minutes. Mark, any comments on Langston Hughes?
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. My dad used to quote him all the time. What was that poem? It was like, my dad was white, my old mom was black. My old dad lived in a castle. My mama in a shack. He used to quote that all the time. As I mentioned earlier, this was one of the most important figures of the Harlem Renaissance. He was an incredibly prolific poet and writer. I have his collection of poems over here on my shelf. It's just, his contributions are so numerous and so important. And he played such an important role, not just in the Renaissance, but here in Kansas as well. It's just, I wish we had more time.
So true. Mark, is there a published book that summarizes Black history in Kansas? Is there a book you can refer people to for Black?
And I mentioned one of them, and it happens to be one of my favorites because the author is one of my favorite people. I had talked earlier about Dissent in Wichita. It's about the civil rights movement in this particular period of time. It's written by Professor Gretchen Castle Ike, E-I-C-K. She'd also make an incredible guest. But a lot of the history in terms of its granularity here in the Midwest, you'll find in that book. For instance, it took Wichita longer to integrate its schools than a lot of school districts in the Deep South. It took 18 years. And the school board in Wichita at one point was talking about foregoing any federal money rather than integrate. President Nixon sent Leon Panetta to Wichita to negotiate a settlement in this case. I mean, that's the kind of reporting and news that's in that book that a lot of people just don't know. And that, people just assume that, there was a march and then they let everybody in school and then everybody was fine. But I mean, it took a long time for both cultures to adjust to being thrown together in these high schools and in these grade schools. And then what you get is this backlash to Brown, where once there were Black teachers and Black administrators, white parents didn't want their children in that school, nor did they want Black teachers for their children. And so it threw a lot of Black educators out of work. But there's a lot of that incredible history in Gretchen's book. That's one that I would recommend.
And what's the gentleman's name again at University of Kansas who teaches African American history?
Sean Lee Alexander, Leigh, and then Alexander, common spelling.
All right. Any other comments from our hosts, co-hosts? You guys got any final comments? This has been so much information. Mark has been, as I knew he would. I will share you one of my favorite stories about that's connected to Langston Hughes Harlem Renaissance. So the Tulsa incident happens in 1921, which began when a lot of the people who survived that, some of them stayed, some of them moved to California. There was a group of them that moved to Harlem, New York.
Mm.
They were so wealthy. Here's the thing: they were so wealthy that when they moved to New York, they provided the financial foundation for what became the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance would not have happened had it not been for the financial undergirding of those people who fled Tulsa after the Tulsa riot. Just a super fascinating story. You can find out more about that story in a book called Black Fortunes, and great book that tells the story of the first 6 or 7 Black people in American history who became very rich, whether they were millionaires, multimillionaires. They were the first 6 or 7 people. And that's why I first learned about Annie Malone, who out of St. Louis, Missouri. By the way, you can go see Annie Malone's mansion. It is still there in St. Louis. Wayne Bell of Wichita tells me, who's from St. Louis, says that they still do an annual parade in Annie Malone's honor. Annie Malone is in the entrepreneurial legacy lineage with Madam C.J. Walker. As a matter of fact, according to this book, she was the first very wealthy person, and then Madam C.J. Walker takes her ideas and some of her concepts and expands on them and becomes, of course, we know Madam C.J. Walker as the first black female millionaire, but many people say it was actually Annie Malone.
I think you'll find that with a lot of fortunes that are made.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
That's a lot of those fortunes that are made. There's one about mentholatum, which is like Vicks vapor rub.
Yes.
A Black woman in Wichita supposedly created it, but never got any of the blessings of that invention.
Hmm.
That's been lore in our newsroom forever.
Wow.
So may I share a poem, a Langston Hughes poem? It goes along with having things snatched from you, but also as we wrap up African American History Month, Black History Month, just thinking about where we came from. And I think we started with Dr. Shana 1440 with the Portuguese in North Africa, but Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor. Bare, but all the time I spent climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps because you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair.
Love it.
Love it. Love it.
Amen, LaDonna. Amen.
It's a bone.
Love it. As a matter of fact, I'm posting that in the comments, the title of that poem with Langston Hughes as author. And then I will share with you all one final thing.
Mother to Son.
Mother to Son is actually the name of it. Thank you. Exactly. It's actually called Mother to Son. We'll put that in the comments. It's actually called Mother to Son. This is the book that I was referring to called Black Fortunes, the story of the first 6 African Americans who escaped slavery and became millionaires. And it is a super fascinating book. It's not just because it talks about these Black people who were entrepreneurs who built fortunes, financial fortunes, but more so because of all the connection and history. In this book is the first time I learned the story about how Harriet Tubman was supposed to be with John Brown. Yes. Mm-hmm. And she wasn't feeling well and decided not to go, but she was supposed to be with John Brown, which is another. So you get a lot of that history in that book. This has been a fascinating journey. Mark, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, you've been such a blessing. We've got to have you back to do some other stuff.
Well, I've been Black my whole life.
Thank you for the amazing for the Kansas African American Museum and now with Kansas ACLU. Thank you for the work you guys are doing over there. Thank you for sharing that information.
And thanks for having me.
And anything that we find help, stay in touch with us in terms of the work that like what you're working on with these young people who are coming out of being. How can we advocate for that? How can we be a part of bringing justice to that kind of issue?
I'll definitely be in touch.
Resurrection.
Oh, yeah.
I will.
And I want to thank my fabulous co-host, my wonderful co-host, Pastor Cheryl. Thank you so much. I have it looks like I just never stop asking you for stuff. Like it's just one day. And now, LaDonna, I got the poor pastor. She's got something to do every night of the week, Pastor Johnson, and she just keeps saying yes. I know a no is coming. I know a rejection, but it hasn't come yet. And I'm so grateful for you, Pastor. Thank you. And I just I think the world of you and honor you, and have so much respect for you and your leadership at Resurrection and Beyond and in the United Methodist Church, and for so many African American women in particular, well, women clergy in general who look up to you and honor you. You've been a trailblazer for so many, and we honor you. And then I want to just thank God for LaDonna Williams. LaDonna, thank you. I know I threw this at you at the last minute. 2 days, I say, LaDonna, Cheryl, can we do this? And then he kept me asking this like 2 days before. Thank you so much, LaDonna.
You are appreciated because you dream dreams bigger than I possibly could dream. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a very kind assessment. I agree. That's a very kind. Thank you, LaDonna. Pastor Ashley, thank you so much. You are just an amazing young lady. You, as I said before, you're so mature. The work you do with our online, which is about 30,000 online, and there are resurrection communities in every state in the union and in 64 countries, and you're responsible for keeping those people connected, providing them with resources through resurrection. And the fact that you are so young and can do that and stay so focused is just absolutely, you have a family, is absolutely amazing. But thank the three of you all for helping me to host this, and thank you to Resurrection, to Adult Discipleship, Allies for Racial Justice, the great St. James, our church, United Methodist Church, led by Emmanuel Cleaver III. Thank all of you all for helping to produce this and bring this. Dr. Shana Masheko, if you happen to be listening, thank you as well for spending 3 weeks with us. We'll do this again with more planning.
Well, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Folks, thank you guys for listening in, and stay tuned stay plugged in to core.org, Resurrection, to find out what's next with Allies for Racial Justice, what's going on with adult discipleship. If you want to hear from more from Pastor Cheryl, she is one of our teachers for our Lenten series that began on last night, which was Wednesday. She'll be back with us on next Wednesday in the Foundry. You can also catch that online. You can register for that course to watch it online if you go to core.org/next to participate and hear more wisdom from Pastor Cheryl. Thank you for listening.
And Ashley, too.
And Ashley, yes, and Ashley, from Ashley and Pastor Cheryl, as a matter of fact. That's right, our co-teaching that class and doing it all. We had a great start last night, and more. Pastor Ann Gatobu will be with us on next week, one of our people, as well as another staff person from Resurrection. We're so excited. Thank you all for listening in. Keep digging into African American history, and don't let anybody tell you that the Black history is separate from American history. We are American history. We are just as much a part of the American story as any other demographic, and you can't get the gist and the greatness of America if you leave out the African American story. Thank you so much. Have a great night.